A regular day at the zoo turned into a real shock when a little boy fell straight into the gorilla enclosure. The crowd froze in horror, expecting the worst. But what happened next surprised everyone. Was it a moment of danger or an unexpected act of compassion? This story will change the way you see animals. Watch until the end. You'll be amazed. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more incredible stories. The gorilla enclosure had always been a favorite spot for children, but today something was different. Ka, the playful gorilla known for her silverback, was unusually inactive. She sat motionless in the far corner of the enclosure, absent-mindedly chewing on a branch. Her dark eyes were thoughtful, a stark contrast to her usual lively self. Normally, Ka would swing, climb, and entertain the crowd, who laughed and cheered as they watched. Adults lifted their children onto their shoulders for a better view. Ben's mother tried to focus on the gorillas, but her restless toddler had other plans. She warned him not to get too close, but he didn't listen. His tiny fingers gripped the railing as he leaned forward, his eyes wide with wonder. He peered into the enclosure, captivated by the creatures that seemed to justify his disobedience in his young mind. His eyes widened, and a small smile spread across his face. One moment, Ben was holding onto the railing. The next, he was gone. A faint gasp, a blur of movement, a dull thud, and then silence. His mother's scream pierced the air. Everyone turned, gasping as they realized what had happened. "Oh God, Ben!" she cried out again, seeing her child lying face down. He wasn't hurt, but he was clearly too stunned to move. He had simply fallen. "My baby!" she screamed, alerting the zookeepers. The staff rushed to the enclosure and peered inside. "We'll get him out, ma'am," they assured her, and she nodded, clutching her necklace. A few people silently judged her for looking away, but they didn't say it aloud. She knew the zookeepers were concerned, but she had to try. Desperate to save her child, she scanned the area for any way to reach him. That's when her eyes met those of a massive 400-pound gorilla standing at the far end of the enclosure. Ka turned her head toward the commotion. The branch fell from her mouth, and she began to move forward. The ground trembled under her steps, and someone in the crowd shouted, "Stop her!" When Ka finally spoke, it was a low, guttural sound. The zookeeper, who had returned with keys and some tools, immediately ran to the emergency room for a tranquilizer. Meanwhile, Ben's mother, panicked, stretched out her trembling hands as if trying to lift her child out of the nightmare. But Ka didn't stop, and the growing crowd froze, watching the tragedy unfold. Some began to cry while others turned away. What do you think will happen before the keepers arrive? The onlookers wondered. Ka's massive body blocked the sun, and the crowd braced for horror. Parents held their children tighter, expecting an attack. But instead, the 400-pound gorilla did something no one expected. She didn't strike, bare her teeth, or growl. Her massive hand gently cradled the tiny boy, lifting him with a tenderness that seemed impossible for a creature of her size. Those who had closed their eyes opened them, but Ben's mother continued to watch in terror. She sobbed as her child disappeared into the arms of something wild and untamed, yet harmless. His body looked so small in her grasp. His lips trembled, and for a moment, it seemed he might cry. But then Ka did something even more unexpected. She held him close to her chest and began to rock him gently. A low, throaty sound emerged from her, a mix of a hum and a warning. She even pressed her wide lips to his forehead in what could only be described as a kiss. Ben's mother shuddered in horror. At that moment, the zookeepers returned with radios and tranquilizer guns, but none of them expected to see this. One turned to the still trembling mother and tried to reassure her. "She's calming him," he observed. But Harris, the senior zookeeper, knew why. He immediately addressed the crowd. "Do you think the child is dead?" Harris had worked with Ka for years. He had seen her grow into a powerful matriarch, protecting her young from danger. He had witnessed her grief just a month ago when she lost her own baby to illness. For days, she had refused to let go of his lifeless body, unable to accept that he was gone. When the zookeepers finally took him away, she had spiraled into madness, hiding in the corners of the enclosure, searching for her lost child. A heavy silence fell over the crowd as they realized what was happening. The expectation of violence gave way to an understanding of grief. All eyes were on Ka, filled with pity. But the scene quickly shifted to concern as they realized another crucial detail. Ka hadn't let go of Ben. Ka gave them hope when she approached the iron fence. Everyone thought she was going to hand over the child, but she simply turned back. People began talking to the zookeepers, hoping they could gently persuade her. However, the staff couldn't act recklessly. If they moved too quickly or scared Ka, she might feel threatened and resist. A mother protecting her child, whether human or animal, becomes the most dangerous creature. Ben, the little boy who had been peacefully playing in his enclosure, suddenly stirred and looked around, making a small sound. His mother clenched her fists. "Mom!" shouted the zookeeper, witnessing the scene. He felt terrible and, driven by compassion, stepped toward the gate. Though he moved slowly, it was enough to cause panic among the spectators. What will the gorilla do? They wondered. Ka, lifting her head, bared her ivory-colored fangs. Then she turned and swiftly retreated to the rocky part of her enclosure. The crowd gasped, and Ben's mother screamed. Harris, watching the scene, felt his stomach twist with fear. Ka, climbing rapidly up the rocky outcrop, dragged the child with her. Someone in the crowd shouted. Ben's mother sobbed, her cries piercing the air. "No, please, stop. Don't take my child." But Ka was fast. She climbed without a sound until she reached the top. The higher she went, the more panic spread through the crowd. They knew that if Ben slipped, even for a moment, they didn't want to think about what might happen. Harris's radio crackled, and a voice came through. "We have the tranquilizer." Harris froze, his fingers hovering over the button. Ka turned, and their eyes met. Hers were pleading, but he shook his head. If they shot her, she might drop Ben, and that was unthinkable. He gritted his teeth and said, "Don't shoot." But the voice argued, "I said, don't shoot." Harris turned to the other keepers surrounding him. Now he had options. He ordered, "If we do this, they'll act." But a sharp crack made them stop. They turned and saw Ka reach the next ledge, but a stone slipped from under her foot. Harris's pulse quickened. One more ledge, and soon she was at the top. Ben, nestled in the gorilla's arms, began to regain consciousness. He looked around in panic, watching the birds fly past as they descended. His mother, still frantic, continued to scream. She pressed against the railing as if trying to break the iron bars. The zookeepers were furious. "Now we can lure her back," suggested another keeper. Harris quickly agreed. He knew what to do. In his pocket were the keys to the side gate. He said the keys had been brought, and the gate was opened. Harris stepped forward, and the crowd whispered. "What is he doing?" they asked. "Is he going in there? Oh God, is he going to get himself killed?" But Ben's mother looked at him with hope. "Please," she whispered. Harris swallowed hard and said, "Bring him back." He entered the enclosure, and the gate slammed shut behind him. Without wasting time, he hurried to the rock where Ka stood and shouted, "Ka, come back!" But the gorilla didn't respond. She took another step, and the child's tiny legs dangled limply in her arms. The risk was immense, but Harris took another step forward. Then he pulled something from his pocket, a faded, worn blanket neatly folded. It was Ka's, the same blanket she had wrapped around her own baby weeks before his death. Ka looked down, and Harris saw a change in her eyes. Hesitation and confusion. She recognized the blanket. She had held it, buried her face in it, and breathed in the scent of her child. Harris held the blanket up and said, "It's yours, sweetheart." All he wanted was for her to come down. But Ka's pupils dilated. She looked at the boy in her arms, then down at the blanket, and then at the world around her. She paused, as if making a decision, then let out a deep sigh and took the first step down. A rush of fresh air filled her lungs, and Harris couldn't believe what was happening. Everything seemed to stand still as she descended, each step echoing with hope. Ben's mother clung to the railing, whispering what might have been a prayer or her child's name. The descent was slow, and Harris continued to encourage her. Finally, when she was just 20 feet from the ground, Ka landed. Harris cautiously stepped forward, and at that moment, another zookeeper tossed her an orange, her favorite fruit. Ka picked it up and handed it to Harris. Her pupils dilated again, but she held the child tighter and moved closer to him. That single motion was enough. Harris lunged forward, grabbed the boy, and pulled him from Ka's arms. Relief swept through the crowd. Ben's mother, accompanied by cheers, ran to the locked gate. Harris, equally relieved, followed. But he soon stopped, clutching the child's tiny hands, and began to cry. When he reached the gate, his mother was already there. She fell to her knees, hugged her child, and burst into tears, covering his hair and cheeks with kisses. "Oh, my baby," she whispered. "Oh God, my baby. Thank you," she said to Harris. Harris, still anxious, straightened up and smiled. Ben was safe. Inside the enclosure, Ka stood motionless, wrapped in the blanket, watching them with her deep orange eyes. Her gaze, fixed on the child, shifted between Harris and Ben. She had found her child again. Harris swallowed hard, realizing this wasn't an attack. Ka, a grieving mother, had been trying to fill her void. He turned to the other keepers and noticed their tearful eyes as they watched Ka's quiet sorrow. "What do you think of Ka's reaction? Did she really know what she was doing?" he asked. Please share your thoughts in the comments. Ka showed no anger or aggression, only loss. She faded into the shadows beyond the zoo, and the news spread quickly. Videos taken by the crowd went viral, even making it to television stations. Everyone who watched was amazed. It sparked debates about animal intelligence. Some hadn't expected gorillas to be so emotionally aware. Some called for stricter zoo regulations, while others demanded Ka be released into a sanctuary. And some, perhaps those who truly understood, saw Ka not just as an animal but as a being capable of profound emotion. Harris, who usually loved giving interviews, declined most of them but released a statement. Ka wasn't attacking. She was grieving. The phrase spread across social media, and people began sharing stories of their own losses and encounters with grieving animals. They sent gifts and donated to the zoo in Ka's name. Some wrote letters urging the zoo to help her. The zoo's management held an emergency meeting to discuss Ka's future and how to help her heal. Finally, they made a decision. They found her an orphaned baby gorilla, helpless and sad, just like Ka. When the cage door opened and the little gorilla stumbled into the enclosure, Ka didn't hesitate. She approached the infant, who let out a soft, nervous sound. She reached out, pulled him close, and hugged him. The keepers exhaled in relief. It had worked, and a few tears disappeared. And so Ka's story ended. This tale shows how deeply grief can penetrate, especially when it involves the loss of a child. It's a pain that defies explanation. It also teaches us that motherhood is a universal bond, uniting us all, whether we're parents of animals or humans. Don't miss more incredible stories about animals.